Thanks everyone for coming to LI for Social Good. No, that does not mean that every other session you saw today was for social bad. This is just a kind of purposely vague title because we're going to cover a lot of different areas of expertise today. So a little bit about me. I'm Tyler Bird. I work on the community team at CARTO. I started my career in nonprofits, working on development and research initiatives in South America, briefly in Uganda, mainly in Colombia and Paraguay, ranging from addressing challenges that face internally displaced populations due to conflict, advocating for child rights in rural, underserved areas, and finding ways to provide affordable housing in contexts in cities where affordable housing is usually something that people build for themselves. So now I have the privilege of working with organizations that are being represented up here today, using technology and creating data-driven solutions to these kind of problems. So the objective of the panel is to kind of just share different strategies and different ways that we can leverage this technology and data in general, whether it's to inform the missions of organizations or to better communicate to donors or potential funders. There's a lot of different uses that we'll kind of explore here. So the panelists today, we have Adam Jasinski, who's the executive director of Halo Trust, which is a humanitarian demining organization that works in over 17 countries, cleaning up unexploded ordinances and landmines. Dylan Macy, who works here in New York at the Citizen Housing and Planning Council, and Craig Mills, who's the CEO of Visuality. So I think we'll start with Adam, who's going to talk about how his work has incorporated LI and data into their different workflows.
Great. Thanks very much, Tyler. So Halo, we've actually just expanded in a few countries. So we're now up to about 23 countries, and we employ about 8,000 people that go out on a daily basis, clearing landmines, unexploded ordnance, cluster bombs, basically anything that goes bang, we will deal with it. Sometimes it's in post-conflict situations, sometimes it's in countries where there is conflict ongoing. The reason we do it is pretty straightforward. If you clear the mines, people don't lose their legs. This is a group of casualties in Cayenne State in Myanmar a few years ago. What we do is inherently geographic. It's about, everything we do is about land. But the first challenge that we have is capturing where the mines actually are. It is extremely rare that the forces that lay landmines make maps. And even when they do make maps of where they've laid the landmines, often those maps get lost in the turmoil of war. If someone's retreating, the last thing they're worrying about is taking their maps with them. So often we have to piece together fragmentary evidence after a conflict has ended. And really that involves community interviews. So we interview farmers, we interview ex-combatants, we interview local military and police, trying to piece together bits of evidence that allows us to map out where we think those minefields are. And then obviously during that process, we work with communities to educate people about the risks, but also gather as much information as we can from them. Once we've actually got all those minefields, we've mapped them out, we have them in a database, then we can get on with the business of clearing them. We either do that with detectors, ground-penetrating radar, metal detectors, or in certain circumstances, we can use machines. What we actually survey as a minefield is not necessarily what we end up clearing. We only have a partial fragmentary idea when we do the initial mapping of what a minefield is. As we go through the actual process of clearing it, we get a much better idea of the scope and scale. In terms of how we've been doing this for many years, field operations, survey, GPS, compass, rangefinder, the teams go out and produce sketch maps like this, piecing together the evidence that they've got from their informants in the field. It's quite rudimentary, but one of the challenges we have that by their very nature, minefields are dangerous, so you can't actually walk the perimeter necessarily and map out where you think the edges of the minefields are. So often you have to do it standing from a safe place, from a road, and project where you think the boundaries are. We then put it into a GIS system. In most countries, we're using ArcGIS, which allows us to build up a picture of where we think the minefields are. In countries like Cambodia, Afghanistan, where there are many years of conflict, we can be talking about upwards of 10,000 minefields sitting in the database. And in the context where we can only perhaps, say, clear 300 minefields in a year, it's very important that we have enough data to help us prioritize which minefields that we clear first. So moving on to how we're using CARTO at the moment, really we're using it as a tool to communicate with the people that support us through grants and donations. One of the key things about what we do is that it's very measurable. You can count the mines, you can count the hectares that you've cleared. And that allows us to provide tools like this that provide complete transparency to our donors. So we can give them maps such as the ones here that show them the locations of the minefields where they have supported funding and a complete breakdown of the beneficiaries. It's a new way for us to really present to donors and allow them to explore what their money's achieved. We can then allow them to zoom in and see, what is the context on the ground of the minefield that we've cleared here. This is in Afghanistan. You can see to the left of the picture, what's called a green zone, where there's flat, fertile land. But Afghanistan, farmers often grow rain-fed wheat on hillsides. So the minefield that you can see there in orange is actually used for growing rain-fed wheat. So again, that's an important aspect of using this kind of tool. Similarly, the ability to embed photographs and data to give donors an interactive means of seeing post-clearance land use is also really important. So here we have an example of farmers using the land after it's being cleared. And again, it's about transparency and accountability of how we're using the funds. In terms of survey, we can also give an impression of what the future work is. So these are remaining minefields around Kandahar International Airport in Afghanistan. You can see that in the northern part of the airfield, there is agriculture coming right up to the perimeter of the base, except where you've got those minefields. So we can see that if those minefields are cleared, it's likely that that will help local families expand the area of agriculture available to them. And also, it gives us the ability to provide evidence of progress and activity. So again, we can provide photographs and data on an ongoing basis of what is going on in the field. It helps us build a connection with the people that support our work. Very few people are actually able to visit Kandahar in Afghanistan because of security reasons. So this gives people an insight into what we're doing on the ground. And then finally, just one more example. Again, this is an educational tool, but it's also a dashboard that allows us to conceive the whole problem in a particular country. So this is Angola. That is a map of about 1,000 minefields that are remaining in Angola. So far, we've cleared about 1,000 in the last 10 or so years. And this is the kind of tool that we can use when talking to governments, particularly the 162 countries that have signed the Mine Ban Treaty and have committed to clearing mines worldwide by 2025. This allows us to present a tool to the public to actually track that progress, essentially in real time, as we begin to tick those minefields off the list. And that's me done.
Awesome.
Thanks, and I know there's a little overlap because you mentioned visualizing data is quite an effective tool, not only for informing your activities on the ground, but also conveying a message to people that want to, adding transparency to the work you're doing, showing progress, showing people what works, what funding is actually resulting in. I mean, I know, Dylan, you do a lot of mix mashing between data visualizations and communication.
Absolutely. Thanks, Tyler. Yeah, so I kind of have a similar background to Tyler. Started out working in Latin America, focusing on Amazonian conservation, really in the Andean region, and then somehow I've made this transformation from making maps about the Amazon to making maps about housing in New York City. So I'm Dylan Massey. I'm from CHPC. We are the city's oldest housing policy organization that's non-governmental. We've been around since 1937. And the basis of what we do is this idea that we're practical, we're not political, we're not pulled by any of the parties. Our kind of main goal is to make sure government doesn't do anything stupid or make any stupid policy decisions. Sorry if there's any representatives from HPD, DCP, or any of the other alphabet organizations. So here you can just check out our mission. It's pretty fun. So I'm going to talk about one of our main kind of flagship projects, which is the umbrella of making room, which looks at how we use location intelligence to understand where we can better make room for New Yorkers as we kind of prepare for a huge influx of new people over the next kind of 3 or 4 years. I think by 2020, there's estimated we'll have almost 9 million people or so, maybe more than that in the city of New York. So one of the projects that's come from this is looking at basement apartments. And CARTO has been a really big part of this project and this process as kind of a tool for data visualization, but also as a policy tool for a proof of purpose. So I'm gonna move forward and talk a little bit about kind of what that is. So as I was talking, between 2000 and 2010, 300,000 new people moved into New York City. So just thinking about the 10-year period from 2010 to 2020, we can expect to add as many or more. So we can either look at building tall buildings like you see on the screen that maybe perhaps alter our skyline, or we can look at the spaces that are beneath our current built kind of environment and look to legalize that, because a large part of that housing stock is currently classified as legal dwellings. So moving forward, this is just a look at the left is I can't see. I think it's investment, I believe. And on the right, these are also maps from CartoDB before they even made the transformation. So these are like archaic maps. You can tell by the old school legends. This is just an idea of how we display data. This is just a proof of purpose to show to our board that there's kind of reasoning that we should be doing this. A big point for going for the basement conversions was that there's no cost of land acquisition. A lot of the rent rolls will be much lower, considering that they're already in built dwellings. And our thought was that they can help house some of the kind of the immigrant population, the foreign population that lives in New York City, and big kind of swaths of these groups of people. They're, I think, one of the biggest neighborhoods that has apartments for basement conversion are Jackson Heights, which is obviously one of the most diverse neighborhoods in the world, probably, I would say. Here's just a picture. We'll go through this. Another big piece of this is looking at how we can make basements more safe. So that's also an aspect of our process and our making room idea. So a big piece of what I do is how do we coordinate with government, with our board, and with kind of policy stakeholders, and kind of the people who are acting on our board, that we can then learn from them, and then kind of take those new learnings, those new knowledges, and then realize kind of policy, making progress on policy. So a big thing we face is regulatory obstacles. How can we don't want to create a policy that we can't then hand off to the government that's unusable, because there's no help in that. So we do work closely with HPD specifically, and with DCP as well when we're talking about kind of land use and zoning. This is just an idea of what a city hall meeting might look like. Just representation of our fight with politics. So our kind of a big piece of this basement study was looking at what is actually viable, because there's two classifications of kind of basement style dwelling units. One of those are cellars, one of those are basements. We call this our 5-filter process, which starts at the total number of New York City single-family houses, and then goes down to a number of about 10,000. We'd say between 10 and 35 is our general kind of basement housing stock, with 10-ish being the low-hanging fruit, that there's no real regulatory obstacles, there's no need to add an additional parking space. It really is just a need for some kind of financial tool to either help renovate and make them legal, or kind of bring them up to code. Here's and then this is the first iteration. Again, this is kind of going back to old CARTO. These are some old pictures, I guess. You can see the archaic legends on the left and the right. But this is just the first pass. This is zoning. This is just a graphic. The difference between a cellar and a basement, it's kind of not necessary. And then another filter we added was looking at flood zones. You don't want to build a basement in a flood zone. It's probably obvious. And then here, a lot of our kind of finding, the final piece of the puzzle was doing a lot of aerial observation, so taking a lot of information from Google Maps, and doing actual spot analysis if there was space for a second parking a parking spot if it was necessary. Um, this is the kind of the last step into our filtration process, which then leads to a map like this. You can zoom in, click on a bubble, tells you the neighborhood, the number of potential basement apartments. And as much as this is a heuristic tool, it's definitely an illustration of, why is this important? Why aren't we kind of chasing after this low-hanging fruit if we're so gung-ho about meeting the mayor's 200,000 units? And then also, it's definitely a policy tool, so we can then identify the best neighborhoods to perhaps start a pilot in. That. And then just kind of highlighting our next steps as we're moving forward. This will be coming soon, an interactive web tool. We're having a design competition to design a fire suppression system for basement apartments, and then also other strategies about moving forward for financial kind of obstacles, et cetera. So yeah, I guess this really fits into our kind of our infrastructure with CARTO. It really just kind of follows with our process, starting with a question with some type of analysis, and then ending with some kind of front-end user-facing tool that can either be interactive, but most of all, it's usable and digestible.
So Craig really needs no introduction. He has a long-standing relationship with CARTO, and we work very closely together still with his role at Visuality. I know you have a wealth of experience across sectors, so I know you could probably tie in some overlapping themes as far as how government and policy and data visualization can marry.
Yeah, thank you very much. So I've got 10 minutes to talk about life, not 5 minutes to talk about life, which is great. So Visuality, we've been in the business of location intelligence for about 10 years now. In fact, we've been in it long enough that we didn't know we were in location intelligence until a couple of years ago. And whereas probably most of the talks you'll hear these next 2 days focus on places where people are, our interest is more on those places in the planet where people are not. And it turns out those places are typically the most important. So it's kind of ironic that we're not particularly intelligent about those locations, I suppose is how you'd put it in that world. So yeah, so what is life? In this case, it's location intelligence for the environment. Actually, we focus on transparency and open government and open data, but Lifyog Gegeg wasn't quite as catchy, so I went with life. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to contrast some of the data that is starting to become readily available, like infrastructure data, and see how that would work in other parts of the environment. So for example, let's see if this works, that's good. We have a lot of data on roads, whether that's collected through things like OpenStreetMap or Google or whoever. In towns and cities and the connection between those, we have very little data on roads in forests. And so what I'm showing you here is a project that we're working on with the World Resource Institute, where we are mapping deforestation, the loss of trees in forests. So you can see in those pink lines, that's just deforestation events. That's not us mapping roads. And the cool thing about deforestation events, well, there's nothing cool about deforestation events, actually. The cool thing about roads is seeing roads in forests is they're normally a good indicator that they're about to clear a bunch of forest. And what's really nice about this now is where before we were being able to map every year the disappearance of trees, which are roughly around about 15 billion trees a year, which seems a real shame. I like trees, but we can now do it we can now look at this every 3 days. So 3 days to 7 days, on the Global Forest website, you can start to look at deforestation events. And what that does when you have data like that is when a tree is chopped down, you can and you see it on a screen, you can go there and you can do something about it. So we've started developing mobile phone applications which are being used by rangers in Indonesia, in Cameroon. This is in Peru. This is some of our team user testing in Peru, where rangers are getting alerts on their phones about deforestation events that are happening, and they are then navigated to those places. So the routing has got nothing to do with how fast you get your Amazon parcel, but how quickly you can get to a place to stop deforestation happening. For me, that seems pretty important, and we need more intelligence like that. I grew up by the sea, as many people did. That's nothing special. But I was always fascinated by ports. I was always fascinated by ships coming into ports, and they gave you this tiny little window of what was happening on 2/3 of the planet, but just a tiny little window. We were finding that I was kind of curious that you'd get, trade and fish and all sorts of things coming into port, but these boats were out there for weeks and months at a time, and you didn't really know what was happening, which is odd because it's like 2/3 of the planet, and you'd think you would want to know what was happening in 2/3 of the planet, especially when those 2/3 are pretty useful for feeding us and for regulating climate and for doing all sorts of interesting things. So it seemed impossible to know what was happening out in the sea, which allowed practices in the sea in terms of fishing, which was difficult to regulate. But what's also true is that governments and private companies and others are collecting location data for medium to large fishing vessels, in fact all vessels, but in this case we're interested in fishing vessels. And you can start to map the location of fishing events happening in the sea. If you can start to do that, you can start to manage those places better. You can start to create sustainable fish stocks. You can start to, which is a real issue because 90% of fish stocks are sort of critical decline. And then, you don't have any fish, you can't feed a lot of people. So I'm painting a really bad picture now, right? So all the trees are going, 15 billion of them a year. All the fish are going, so we've got no air and no food. This might be a problem. So we should probably do something about that. So this is why we're trying to be intelligent about these maps. Now, these systems that we're operating in, whether it's farming or fishing or logging or whatever, there's a reason why these activities are happening. And quite often it's related to our consumption of food. What we've done here is we've been looking at the movement of agricultural commodities from the municipality in Brazil. In this case, this is soy in Brazil, all the way through to from the exporting companies, all the way through to the country that the soy originates in. So let's say you've got a company here like Bunge, which is a great name for a company. Bunge has agreed to a zero deforestation commitments. And what we can do now is we can see where that soy is coming from, right down to the municipalities in Brazil, and we can start to say, well, hang on a minute. Is there massive deforestation happening in those places that you're sourcing your soy from? Now, and this is publicly available, right? This is transparent, open data, which can clearly influence, I would imagine, influence people in Bunge to make sure, at the very least, that they're going to those farmers and making sure that their farming practices are sustainable. If the farming practices are sustainable, then we all benefit, and actually consumers are now starting to want products which are coming from sustainable farming. I should mention, actually, as I'm going through this, sitting in a CARTO locations talk, that most of these things that I'm showing you, a large part of them of CARTO as the back end and the front end maps. So we've been trying to do this for fishing, for forestry, for food, for agricultural commodities. So the thing about these environmental systems is they're very complex and they're very broad. And the ability to understand what's happening in the environment is very much linked with whether the information is available and it's available for people to do interesting things with, like map it. So we've been working on this other project called Resource Watch. And in Resource Watch, we've put together with a whole load of organizations, but predominantly the World Resources Institute, 200 plus highly curated data sets relating to the resources of all sorts of things. So can we do this with everything? So this is one of the largest mangrove forests in the world, right? This comes from one of my previous organizations, the UN Environment Programme. And if you add population data from the Joint Research Center and look at the change in population over time, that northern end of the mangroves is being like hemmed in. It's being stopped there, right? Then you add on projections of water extent from flood events, from typhoons, from these kinds of things. Then the mangroves are getting screwed at the other side, in the south side. So where normally the mangroves would shift and move based on like what's changing around them in the environment, this is becoming impossible. And this may be just an interesting environmental biological problem because like the Bengali tiger are in those mangroves, and maybe some of the people living close by that keep getting eaten by them probably wouldn't particularly mind them not being around. It's not so good for the hundreds of millions of people that are just on the other side of those mangroves, which are doing a huge job in protecting them, which is ironic because all that change of land in the north there is changing the runoff and the siltation of the mangroves, which is making them disappear even further. Now, you can tell these stories through these sort of maps if you've got this highly curated data available to anyone who wants to tell this story. That's actually surprisingly difficult. And what's becoming even more obvious is in the work that we do is what's just as difficult are finding human beings that have the skill sets to make things with these pieces of information. So you'll see lots of technology in maps these next few days, I'm sure. And maybe people will talk a little bit about the capabilities that are required to make applications like this, because it's quite difficult. And it's getting more difficult because the data available and the systems that we're trying to model are becoming more complicated. So today, in fact, I like to say it was deliberate, but it was a little bit by coincidence. We're going to be starting a new program where we're really interested in making sure that people in the non-profit and social good sector have the skill sets to be able to build applications like these. And in fact, not just build applications like these, because it becomes very apparent if you've ever watched, well, we're in the US, so Congress or the UK Parliament debating anything to do with technology and the internet is kind of phenomenally painful to watch. And you can't blame them. Like, it's just they don't have those set of skills to be able to know what to do with the internet. But I don't think that's acceptable. And I don't think it's acceptable that either the leaders at the very top or people that have a burning desire to do better in the world can do it. So which is why we're starting a new academy called Future Good. So we're starting in a very modest way. We'll be running training sessions in Washington, D.C. in July. And we're opening that up to people to be able to learn maybe how to show some of these applications and make them so we can solve some of these massive problems that we face. And on that cheery note, I'm going to stop. Normally, so I've worked in the UK government, for the UN, and now in a private company. And one of the main things that I've learned is that the more you go towards the non-profits, the more logos you have to put on things. So I didn't talk anything about organizations that worked on those projects with us, because I think it ruins the flow of presentations. But there are a huge amount of people that work on these things alongside us. And so these are some of them. Thank you very much.
So I have a couple questions to get us started, and then I'd love to open it up to the audience. So if you have questions, we have some mics floating around. Just raise your hand. We'll get you a mic. So since we're looking at a page full of logos, you've worked in government, you've worked in United Nations, you're worked in the private sector. How do you pick out the organizations that you partner with? What's the process of identifying, okay, this government has data that's useful, that they're willing to open up. This company has the skills, right, that this nonprofit doesn't have, but this nonprofit has access to local communities. How does that process work? And how much of your time is actually spent on aligning all those pieces before you actually start creating things?
Yeah, so the cynical and not entirely true answer is the ones that pay us. But no, that is true. But the way in which we form these partnerships is often heavily based on the nonprofits. They sit actually at the very center of facilitating the private sector, the governments, and anyone else who needs to partner with us. So we do a lot of work with the World Resource Institute, for example. And the people with the data are often, it's obvious because they have something which no one else has, and they show it at a conference, and people get excited and go, wow, I can do something interesting with that. So they come in, and generally they want to do good things with the information that they produce. There seems to be there was I'm not sure there is or not now. So we worked on a project called PREP, which was all about making climate data available to counties in the US. It was an initiative which was formed out of the White House. Funnily enough, we don't do it anymore. But at the time, there was a big push there to create these public-private partnerships. And that worked exceptionally well. The difficult thing was, for some of the people in the partnerships, they're not used to huge bureaucracy. So 5-hour meetings, which seem perfectly normal in the White House, doesn't seem quite so normal when you're like a 40-person startup, you know. So yeah, often they're quite organic, but they're often the centerpiece is the nonprofit in there.
Yeah. And Adam, so it was 23 countries actually that you work in, right?
Yeah.
What does it look like when you're trying to universalize a database management system or location intelligence tools so that all your organizations across different countries, across different contexts, different resources available to them? What does that process look like? Where are you in that process, and what's been the biggest challenge?
At the moment, it's a mess. So if you want to know how it's done well, maybe come back and ask in 3 years.
Sure.
I mean, essentially at the moment, we run 23 data management systems that are all very slightly different. So we have core data, which is common across countries. So, for example, Sextus aggregated data about beneficiaries, the number of mines cleared, the type of mines that have been cleared. But often there is a requirement from local organizations or from local governments that we provide certain amounts of data in different ways in different places, whether it's about land use, whether it's about the military context of those minefields, how they were laid, the types of devices there. And what's happened is that as programs have evolved in different countries, they've been adding boxes to their forms, so that the number of columns in the database has been expanding. And so even when you send out a template, they tend to diverge. So one of the big projects that we need to undertake now is really to try and rein in this data and consolidate it, because we don't have the resources and the time to build 23 custom implementations of CARTO, for example, to demonstrate the results in a particular country. We want to do it once and use it to demonstrate what we're doing everywhere.
Sure.
So that's going to be one of the big challenges for us going forward over the next couple of years.
And what's a new conflict? Is Syria the priority right now, or is it do you have access, or I know there's some countries like Angola and Laos and Cambodia that have had this problem for decades. But what's next?
So the big challenges for us at the moment are Syria and Iraq. Yemen is an emerging challenge, and we've been working in eastern Ukraine for a few years. We do have access to some areas in Syria, but that's a good example where we're dealing with primarily urban environments in Syria. One of the huge challenges there is collapsed buildings. So even to get to the mines or unexploded ordnance, you have to move a lot of concrete and rebar out of the way. We're starting to have to think about mapping in 3 dimensions. One of the huge problems in Syria is improvised explosive devices. Those devices might be on the 3rd, 4th, or 5th floor. So how are we going to represent those on maps? So actually there are new challenges emerging in Syria, in particular in the way that we manage our data.
What's the first approach to mapping an improvised explosive on the 3rd floor of an abandoned building? And
carefully.
Yeah.
Is, I think one of the things that is really a game changer in that field in particular is using UAVs in an inspection role. So with traditional mines, UAVs aren't particularly useful because if the mines are buried, the tolerances for detection are so high that you can't really fly a UAV with enough definition to actually get close to the mines. But when you're dealing with objects that are in buildings, essentially they're above ground, it's much easier to send in a drone to actually do an initial inspection and see what's in there, particularly if there's a suspicious object that's been investigated. So that would be a first way of doing it.
And switching gears slightly in the urban realm.
A little less sexy.
Mapping basements, also not easy, right? So you've done the project, you've visualized a lot of this data, you're bringing it to the city. You mentioned a pilot project that could be soon. How do you get this in the right in front of the right eyes? How do you get in front of new eyes that could actually move these kind of initiatives forward?
Yeah, it's definitely kind of one of our biggest challenges is finding the right people to put the research in the hands of. Luckily, we work with some pretty great funders, the New York Community Trust. I'll do my rounds now, thanking the folks. The New York Community Trust and the Charles H. Revson Foundation. They both have really immense networks that kind of help leverage some of our knowledge. But also, we have a unique board, which is made up of 90 folks, which is kind of absurd if any of you work with boards. So making 90 people happy is pretty difficult, but it's also having 90 pretty fantastic minds to bounce ideas off of. And they're obviously our first kind of line of defense. We usually present to our executive committee, and then we think about the right strategy and who at a government organization do we approach? Do we approach it from the level of the commissioner, or who can make decisions but aren't really the boots on the ground folks who are actually working in the communities and working to change policies? And we also rely heavily on community-based organizations, which I feel like are the equivalent of like an organization focused on deforestation. They have the intimate local knowledge, which is really what you should be tapping into, especially as we move forward with pilot projects. HPD has announced the first one, which will be in East New York, which was kind of against our suggestions, because there's about 12 basement apartments that are eligible for legalization in East New York, which is probably the fewest of any neighborhood. So that's where our pilot's going to be. So, but yeah, it's definitely it's definitely like a whirlwind ballet dance with a bunch of people who all think they're all the most important, which is, I guess, is cross industry, and then figuring out a way to kind of leverage these less sexy ideas but still important, and try to make them look sexy, which is kind of my job. So hopefully it looks sexy.
I'm curious if there's overlap between some of the conservation efforts that Visuality is a part of, or Resource Watch, and the contamination that Halo Trust is trying to rid the world of. How often are people spearheading a conservation effort because there was a conflict there, as landmines are often, aside from the case in Syria, often in very rural, remote areas, or even national parks, perhaps?
So the first thought that came to mind when I was watching the Landmines presentation was I wanted to ask you about Angola.
Yep.
And so the Okavango Delta, the headwaters of the Okavango Delta, which Okavango is obviously, I'm sure everyone knows, is an incredibly important area in Botswana. Well, the headwater is some of it's in Angola. And it's been, I think, and my knowledge is a little sketchy, but I think a number of that has been actually protected because as a result of there being landmines in the area. And so yeah, maybe you can correct me a little bit on that. But so I know there is now effort to start developing on that space, and part of that development is pushing landmine clearing in that area. So there's this kind of interesting mix of landmines forming a little bit of a protection of certain spaces because no one's willing to go in there and do something. Is that right? Or have I just read that somewhere and it's fake news?
To some extent, yes. We've been supporting a research project by National Geographic for the last few years to do expeditions into southeast Angola, which was one of the areas that saw the heaviest fighting during the Civil War, which lasted well over a decade. And wildlife was decimated during the Civil War because of just the need for bushmeat and also just the general course of the conflict. I think the effect of landmines is that you obviously have the basic fact that there are elephants that step on landmines and die as a result. So that's a very basic problem that demining aims to solve. Where it becomes more complex is that minefields become a barrier for development, but they don't necessarily become a barrier for bushmeat hunting or for poaching. Because particularly in areas where there is a lack of sustainable development, where there's a lack of opportunity, people's risk equation changes. We see often in places like Cambodia, 75% of people that have mine accidents knew that the land that they're on had a certain risk of mines being present, but there was an economic drive for them to cultivate that land because they had absolutely no other choice. So certainly our view on this is that if you clear the mines, it allows you to actually develop infrastructure and implement sustainable development. You can't manage a conservation area if your rangers can't actually get in there safely in the first place. So that's really our ambition in Southeast Angola, is to clear the mines so that the area can responsibly develop. And there's a basic point here as well, that the majority of countries in the world have signed a mine ban treaty, which obliges them to remove mines. So we need to find other opportunities and other ways of promoting conservation without leaving mines in place.
So we have 4 minutes. I'd like to open it up to the audience for questions. I think we have a couple over here. We have mic runners around. There's one back here, and there's one up front as well.
Hi. You've all kind of touched on this a little bit, but I just wanted to ask, considering that all of you provide a great mission, how do you deal with data that goes against that mission if you find it to be actually reliable?
Any takers?
Have you got data that's against our mission? I'm just curious what data you mean.
Just in general. So, like, looking at the mangrove, you found that it was actually preferable for human development to have people move into that area.
We usually just won't move forward with the project, I guess, is an answer. I mean, our process is very exploratory. We're an education-based nonprofit, so we're not lobbying or anything. We're just here to kind of educate the general public on what the housing stock of New York City needs. So we usually start with some kind of crazy question that perhaps no other organization is searching after, and we'll then try to find out what data is there. And there will be plenty of times where we start this process and we hit major roadblocks, especially. Even over the past 2 years, open data here in New York has gotten, I think, exponentially better. But even having to deal with FOIA requests and foiling the government for data that's public, we've definitely run into some issues there. And that's we have an example of one project that just had a stop sign placed on it for over 2 years while we waited for a FOIA request to kind of process. So usually we either hit a hard stop or we try to search elsewhere for data. Or if it tells the story that we don't want it to tell, then we just present it as it is.
Yeah, I guess from our point of view, I was trying to dredge my brain if we've had a situation where we had data that we didn't want to tell people the story of it, and that's not really how it works. So a good example might be the commodities data. Now, you could say and it's easy to be simplistic in a 10-minute, talk, but you could say that if Bungie operates in an area where it's clear there is high deforestation and it's a result of soy production, then you could say, right, Bungie, don't you dare work in that area anymore. But that's actually not a very wise thing to do, because there are other actors which would probably work in those areas, and a company that is committed to zero soy deforestation probably would go in and work with the farmers to change it. So even though it may seem like, and then maybe that's a message you might not want to say out loud. Actually, yeah, no, keep operating. But it's actually okay. You've just got to have it's really important to have the data which is open and transparent so you can make the right choices, whatever those choices happen to be. It becomes a problem when it's not available and you can get away with whatever you like. And you can't be held accountable to anyone. And I think that's where there's a problem. So, yeah, I struggled with answering because it's never happened.
So we have a question here, and I think I saw some hands over this side too. Yeah, okay, yep. Okay, go ahead.
So these platforms, and obviously the research that you do, help you to track actions, predict trends, and show the results. But how do you actually influence policymakers to take action based on this data?
For us, it's quite straightforward in that we can quantify the number of people impacted by a minefield. And also we have the luxury of something that has a finite end. I mean, leaving aside ongoing conflicts, you know, we know there is no conflict in Cambodia. There is a finite number of minefields that have been cleared, and we can calculate in great detail not only how many people would use the land once it's cleared, but we can also make projections about the economic benefit. You know, what is the value of the crops that are going to be grown on that? What impact will that have on the community? So we can make actually quite a clear, quantifiable case for why those minefields need to be cleared, even leaving aside the basic humanitarian aspect of trying to stop people losing their legs.
Yeah, it's a little bit harder for us. It's not so easy to quantify policy objectives, but for example, one of our past projects that stemmed from making room, we considered it successful because HPD allowed for a special RFP to build a micro-unit apartment complex between 27th and 28th on the east side, called Carmel Place. So for that, that's a way that we kind of gauge our success, is if, you know, we see this pilot as a direct result of our research. The way we're positioned, we don't necessarily, you know, always get the credit for putting it in the New York Times or getting it in the news, because it's not so important for us to have our name necessarily attached to things. It's sometimes more strategic to attach someone else's, attach it to a government memo or something. But it's really, for us, it's definitely hard to quantify. But we really just try to present the facts, and then present it as many places as possible, hold as many events as possible, and just try to spread knowledge as we can, and then hopefully policy responds.
Craig, the final word if you want it.
Sure. I've seen it work best when the policy makers are included in the process. So it's not standing up on stage and presenting something like this. It's normally sitting in a room with a bunch of people that are there to make choices and decisions, and then they use the data in that way. It doesn't always happen. You know, there's lots of other drivers which have nothing to do with transparent data, I don't think I come under any illusion that it's easy. The other problem there, of course, is that policy is a slow-moving process.
Absolutely.
And this is not. So there is a problem there too. But I don't know. We saw it with the Global Fishing Watch, where the European Union changed their regulation around fishing vessels operating off West Africa as a result of seeing what was out there. And that's from lots of hard work from lots of non-profits and governments and the UN and all these other people that are trying to do good. But at least they come with truth in their hands, you know.
Well, on that, let's thank our panelists. And